This is Megan Raymond with WCET. Welcome to WCET's first vidcast. We're excited to use the technology so that you can interact with us and you can see us. So this is going to be a little different than how we usually do it, which is just audio. So the speakers have audio and video access. If you'd like, there's not going to be a lot of slides today, so if you're familiar with the Blackboard Collaborate platform, you already know this trick, but you can actually drag and drop the video box from the left menu, so you can just drag that over into the right-hand portion of the screen and enlarge that so you can see the presenters. Any questions, just let me know. So because we have video and audio, the way you'll interact with us is through the chat box, which is on the lower left-hand side here. So feel free to add any notes, comments. The moderators will be keeping track of your questions as they come up, and then we'll get to those during the Q&A period. Again, my name is Megan Raymond. I'm Program Manager here at WCET. Thank you again to Blackboard Collaborate for making this platform available. We are recording this presentation, and we'll make the archive, any resources that are shared, and the PowerPoint available next week. So we'll post that on our website, and I'll also send it to all of the registrants. As we go along, go ahead and enter your questions and answers, and we'll keep track of those. If for some reason we don't have a chance to get to all of the questions during this 75-minute presentation, I'll go ahead and pull those out and share those with the presenters and have them provide written responses as they can. I'd like to go ahead and introduce our moderator today, Christopher Murray. He's a partner with Thompson Coburn LLP, and he's a good friend of ours in Washington, D.C. Please welcome Christopher.
Hey, everybody. As Megan introduced me, my name is Chris Murray. I'm a partner in the Lobbying and Policy Group at Thompson Coburn here in Washington, D.C. I'd like to start by thanking WCET to invite me and our great panel to present here today, and particularly Megan for all her hard work in setting this up. I'd like to start with some housekeeping about how this is going to go down. I'm going to begin with a very brief history of HEA reauthorizations. I'm then going to move over to panelist introductions, and I'm going to ask each of the panelists to keep their introduction to about a minute or less so we can get this into a real robust conversation. In terms of the conversation, my goal as moderator would to keep it fast-paced, maybe provocative at times, and have the speakers, I'll invite them to say things that maybe are throwing bombs a little bit and say some things that are pretty provocative if they can or they feel comfortable doing so. We're going to divide this into a couple different subject areas. We're going to begin with politics and process, then oversight and regulation, affordability, innovation, and then we'll have some concluding questions. After all this is done, we'll have about 15 minutes of Q&A at the end, and as Megan said, we will answer any questions that you have that don't get answered via written responses. Finally, since this is the first time we're doing this via the web chat, I'd ask you to bear with us on technology. The technology is supposed to pick up whoever's speaking. If one of us is laughing or doing something else, it might toggle between one person or another. So I'd ask you to just cross your fingers along with us to make sure that this all works. So let me get into 3 minutes or less on the history of the Higher Education Act. The HEA, Higher Education Act of 1965, was one of the centerpieces of LBJ's Great Society. Though the law in its present form is organized into 8 sections, it's Title IV that achieved many of President Johnson's goals. Title IV includes many or most of the provisions related to federal financial aid, including need-based grants, loans, work study, and other forms of assistance. The HEA requires periodic reauthorization or else it expires. The law has been through 9 iterations, the original law, and then reauthorizations in 68, 72, 76, 80, 86, 92, 98, and 2008. The longest intervening period between reauthorizations was the most recent one, between 98 and 2008. During this period, the law was extended incrementally through a series of extension acts. From a historical perspective, it's pretty interesting because HEA reauthorizations, when viewed from 30,000 feet, you have the same core political disagreements over 5 decades. So the core political disagreements between the parties are almost exactly the same today as they were in 1965, namely whether to provide grants, loans, or tax credits, how much aid to provide middle and high-income students, the deepening direct involvement of the federal government, and the growth in number and cost of HEA programs, particularly Pell Grants. For the e-learning community, the watershed moments in HEA reauthorizations occurred in 1992, 1998, and 2006. In 1992, Congress allowed Title IV for distance education for the first time. In 98, Congress added the Distance Education Demonstration Program, and in 2008, which is a temporary extension, not a full extension of the law, Congress repealed the 50% rule. And now we have both the House and Senate in 2014 deep into HEA reauthorization hearings, and the 10th iteration of the law is on the horizon. So I'm going to move to our panelist introductions, 1 minute or less, please, guys. I'm going to start with Russ, then move to David, and then move to Allison. So Russ?
Chris, thank you very much, and thank you for moderating today. I'm Russ Poulin. I'm Interim Co-Executive Director of WCET. Glad to be with you here today. I also will probably mention that I'm on the Program Integrity Negotiated Rulemaking Committee being run by the Department of Education. I may refer to that a few times today. With that, I'll turn it back to you, Chris.
Great. David, you're up next.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm David Bergeron. I'm the Vice President for Post-Secondary Education Policy here at the Center for American Progress. I joined the center about a year ago, having spent 34 years in the Department of Education and worked on reauthorizations from there from 1980 forward.
Great, thanks. Allison?
Hi, I'm Allison Dembeck. I'm the Director of Congressional and Public Affairs at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I'm basically the education and labor lobbyist here. And I've been with the Chamber about a year and a half. Before that, I was on the Senate side. I was the Education, Labor, and Pension person for the Republican Policy Committee, for Senator Gregg, and for a number of other folks. I've spent about 10 years on the Hill before coming to the Chamber. So.
Great, thank you so much, Allison. So the first section here, first section of questions is going to be on politics and process. So before we get deeper into the policy weeds for the WCET community, let's begin by discussing the politics behind HEA reauthorizations. Allison, what committees on Capitol Hill have jurisdiction? Will the players be the same in the next Congress, which starts in January 2015 after this fall's midterm elections? Allison?
So there's 2 committees on the House side. It's the Education and Workforce Committee, and on the Senate side, it's the it's the Health Committee. It's the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. And actually, no matter what happens in the elections, things will look very different next year than they do now. On the House side, the key Democrat, George Miller from California, is retiring, and so there will be a new lead Democrat, likely Congressman Bobby Scott from Virginia. On the Senate side, it's anybody's guess as to what it's going to look like. The Republicans need to pick up 6 seats in the Senate, and there's a good chance that that'll happen. And if that's the case, then actually it becomes a free-for-all, basically. There'll be a new chairman. It's a question as to whether or not it goes back to Senator Enzi, who was the chairman before, whether it's going to be Senator Alexander. So it could be very interesting.
Great, thanks, Allison. David or Russ, do you want to weigh in on politics at all in this election year?
So I agree with Allison's assessment that there's going to be really very significant changes within the composition of the House and Senate committees. I think that very likely we will see different people as chair and ranking members of those committees, and it will take time for those individuals to get grounded, get staff in place, and so that will impact the timing of reauthorization just as much as the membership of the committee itself.
Great point, David. Thank you. Russ, anything on politics?
The political part.
Wait, pardon me, Russ. I didn't hear what you said.
I'll pass on the political
okay.
part.
Well, Russ, my next question is for. Oh, sorry. My next question is for you anyway. So, as someone who works in distance education and educational technology,
I'll pass on the political
what concerns do you have about the upcoming HEA reauthorization? you can bear with us.
Let's see. Well, I apologize. It looks like I just lost my video, so I'll work on that in a moment. But I'll go ahead and talk about the issues. The issues that I have is that last time, as you mentioned, that it took about 10 years for the reauthorization to happen, and then what happened in that time period is that I think we sort of lost track of what was or was not happening, and that perhaps we could have done a better job of informing what finally came out of that. Second, we're already seeing all sorts of information coming out, or bills, or concerns, or I mentioned the negotiated rulemaking, with lots of issues that affect our community. And some of these including just the overall affordability issues, curbing financial aid fraud, curbing cheating in online courses, the accessibility of technologies, promoting alternative providers of education, that there's been bills around that, the changing accreditation requirements, the treatment of adjunct faculty, just financial aid rules for distance ed, promoting open content, and state authorization, of course. So there's a number of issues that are already on the table, and I imagine that more will come. And then finally, in looking at this, that what we keep finding is that through no fault of their own, that a lot of the people either in the House or in their Senate or their staff that just don't have any knowledge, firsthand knowledge of how distance ed or online ed or a lot of these educational technologies work. We're finding that more and more people do, but there's still a lot of folks who don't, and so we really need to get in there and let them know what is really happening.
Great, thanks so much, Russ. So the next question I'm going to turn to while you're trying to fix your video is, there's a lot of media attention these days on political partisanship. How do you think the current political atmosphere will impact the potential for HEA reauthorization, particularly as this is an election year? David got into this a little bit, but I'd like to talk a little bit more about partisanship and not just the individual players. Is it too early to tell, given the upcoming committee changeover in committee leadership in both chambers, whether we're going to get more partisan next year or less? I'd like to start with David.
So, the Higher Education Act has historically been one of these issues around which there's been very little partisan disagreement, going back really since the beginning of the higher education experience. That changed the last time, which is why it took a long time to get reauthorized. A lot of the arguments, though, around higher education were around how student loans should work, and those issues were decided in the Higher Education and Education Reconciliation Act in 2010, and so at least those issues are theoretically off the table during this next reauthorization. I say theoretically because just this week we saw Senator Rubio and Congressman Petri introduce legislation to create a private sector-based student loan marketplace. And so, some of the partisanship that has appeared in the past and I thought was off the table has come back, and so I worried about that a bit. But I do think that if we can keep this conversation focused on students and what's best for students, we have the ability to keep that conversation from becoming overly partisan and really stay focused on making improvements to the aid programs in the aid delivery system to the benefit of all students.
Allison, what's your take on partisanship?
I think that the partisanship will be toned down a little bit after the elections, and in 2015 there'll be a really good chance of being able to get past it. Like David said, this is not an issue that is usually so split that something can't be accomplished. But if it's not done in 2015, I do think that partisanship is going to rear its ugly head and we get closer and closer to the presidential end. So it's a short window, but I think it's possible.
So a quick follow-up to both David and Allison. Do you think that the conversation about the direct loan program is dead and accepted on both sides, or I know this is a loaded question, or whether we're going to get back into FFEL versus direct loans. That's the Stafford program versus the federal program, and that's just an issue that's going to come up in the next reauthorization and everyone after that.
I think that there's going to be a conversation about it. There has to be a conversation about it. It's something that the Republicans are continuing to hang on to. However, the reality is that to go back to the FEL program has such a high cost attached to it. So Republicans aren't going to be able to pay for it. So while they'll continue to talk about it and it'll continue to be part of the drumbeat, it's not a realistic policy option.
And David, what do you think?
No, I agree totally with Allison. The cost of moving back to a bank-based loan program would be something that the Congress can't afford, and it would move resources away from the needs of students. And so I think that the keeping the focus on students will help make sure that we don't move back to those conversations.
Great. Well, I'm going to move on to oversight and regulation now. The first question here, how do you see the roles of the triad, federal, state, accreditation, specifically in terms of the regulation of online programs? Is the triad working well or not? What's good and what's bad about the current regulatory environment? I'd like to begin with you, Russ.
Great. Yeah, thank you. To begin with, to say that it's broken would probably be an understatement at this point. It seems to me that each of the three parts of the triad, the federal government, the accrediting agencies, and the state agencies, have missions, and missions which are different in that they're working to fulfill their mission, but yet they're supposed to be working together. I think a lot of the and then there's been concerns that each of the other is not doing their job, and I don't think that there's been a really good open process in terms of getting that out on the table about what does each of those sectors think that the other is not doing, and what can be done to improve their working together. And this is just the logician, not the politician in me, thinking about how things would work. I don't know if politically that could ever happen in terms of trying to get everybody together, but you have all the 50 different states going their own way and how they want to judge quality, and they're thinking of that differently than from what the accreditors are, and then the department and the federal government is trying to rely on both. And so it's a system where all the partners have drifted off, and there needs to be some way to bring them back together.
Great answer. Allison, what do you think about the triad?
I agree a lot with what Russ said. The system is broken, and it does need to be fixed. I think it's something that is going to have to be addressed in reauthorization. I think it's something that is being focused on even in the conversations now, but I don't actually think that there's a good answer yet, and I think that it's something that staff is struggling with, particularly when it comes to something like online learning. The idea of trying to meet different standards in every state is going to be difficult for a lot of schools, and so there's a burden requirement that I think folks are going to have difficulty meeting, and that then affects costs and everything else. But at the same time, there's the need to balance that states need to do what is best for their individual needs. So I think it'll be an interesting discussion. I'm not sure that there's a good answer out there yet.
And David, as our resident who has actually been part of the triad and a leader in one of the triad, what do you think?
Well, I was a leader of one and a regulator and overseer of the other in the sense of accreditation. I think when we look at the environment today, we have lots of redundancy of roles, and then performance against those roles that is mixed. And in some states we see tremendous efforts on the part of the state, oversight of higher education. Other states, nothing happening at all. We see the same kind of phenomenon with accreditors, and at the end of the day, it is students and families that suffer. And you know, at some point, we really have to get beyond that and find solutions that work. I think that you know, some of the evolutions in education, both online and things like competency-based that I've written about, really provide opportunities to capture if somebody has a phrase that some people have used lately with me, these artifacts of learning that would help us to be able to know and to judge it in a meaningful way the quality of what's going on in our educational experiences in ways we haven't been in the past. So I think there's tremendous promise as we go forward with new modes of delivery and new technologies to really begin to have a much more informed and in-depth conversation about what it means to deliver quality education.
Yeah. Thanks, David. I love that term, artifacts of learning. It just really hits the nail on the head. So the next question, Russ, I was hoping you could give us a quick summary of the recent report that came out of the Office of Inspector General at the U.S. Department of Education about fraud in e-learning. And then I'd like to move to David to explain how the report will be received and then processed within the department. And then finally, if Allison could let us know how, if at all, the report would be influential to lawmakers when it comes to reauthorization. So this OIG report, Russ, if you could start us off.
Thank you, Chris. I will. And that this Office of Inspector General report looked at fraud, and they looked at the issue fraud and at the issue in a large sense, but also look specifically at a small number of institutions who you would hope that have a large number of online students, and then you would hope that they were be handling this very well. And the results were a bit disturbing because there is still a large amount of fraud going on in regards to federal financial aid and distance education students. And speaking on behalf of the distance education community, we need to be part of that solution. We can't be sitting on the sidelines on this one. Otherwise, we're really going to get hurt on this, and we got to make sure that we're protecting money for needy students instead of going to fraudsters. Now, there were some really good recommendations in the report that had to do with checking identities. It had to do with more flexibility or doing different things in terms of when federal financial aid was dispersed, because if you think about it, that the fraudsters, what they want to do is that if they get all their money at one time, they just stay in the course to that time and then get their money and then go away. But if you disperse it over several time periods, that helps to battle that sort of behavior. There's a couple other things that I do worry about in there that they've had for years, this idea in terms of the last day of attendance. I do think that there needs to be attention to that, but the way it is currently is being done, so last day of attendance would be for a student who withdraws from a course but does not officially notify the institution that they're withdrawing. They just disappear. So in order to figure out how much money goes back to the federal government, that the institution has to figure out what was the last day that student was engaged in the course. Right now, there's an expectation that you go back and find the last academic activity, and so there's an issue with that, though, is that it ends up being a huge reporting burden for institutions, because you don't know which students are not going to drop out, and so you have to start keeping tests, quizzes, papers, all sorts of academic activities for all the students, essentially. So that ends up being a large storage and maintenance problem. But there has to be a way around that where we can work that through. The last couple things I want to say, that there is a proposal that's a little unclear about limiting aid eligibility for distance ed students, and just want to make sure that we're not punishing the innocent by just carving out distance ed students and then reducing the amount of aid that they get unless there's a good reason for it other than just the fraud. And then then the last thing is that I really think that education is needed, that we need to let faculty and other frontline workers know what does fraudulent behavior look like. I don't think we do a very good job of that right now, so that when they start running into these students who are trying to keep the faculty to keep them on the rolls, so that they won't, even though that they haven't done anything, so that they can keep the money. Well, a lot of times those are people who are just in it for the fraud. They're not really students. And there's a lot of other activities that are known and that these people tend to do that we need to let those people on the front lines know what to be looking for. Thanks, Chris.
Great. Thanks so much, Russ. Just quickly on your point on last day of attendance, I saw this tech startup that has a technology that does facial recognition that has, I think, above a 95% certainty, and it works with students so that it is constantly taking that facial recognition every 10 minutes or so, and they keep the data. So perhaps on last day of attendance, or maybe even some of these other issues, there'll be technological solutions in the future that don't require a huge burden for the institutions, but also provide the prevention of fraud that we need for both taxpayers and for institutions themselves. So that was my little aside. David, switching to you, how is the OIG report accepted and processed within the department? What did you think of the report? And tell us a little bit more about that. Yeah, you're the expert here.
This is actually probably the third in a series of reports that the Inspector General has done on fraud. They did one a couple of years ago working through in particular schools that had brought forward to them things that they thought looked and felt like fraud, and the Inspector General investigated that. They then went through and tried to quantify it in a big picture sense, tried to come up with a total amount of fraud that was being observed, and then the more recent study that they've conducted. The thing that's important about Inspector General reports from the department's perspective is they've got to be resolved. You just don't ignore an Inspector General report. If you do so, you end up with these audit findings that hang out there and which are taken into account by appropriators, by the Office of Management and Budget, and so you really just can't ignore them, and you have to take some significant actions to resolve them. We were fortunate when the first Inspector General report came out because the Inspector General's office really wanted to get out in the community and talk with the community about the fraud that was occurring and how they could combat it on the campus. And so that was a really helpful part of the process, and which will be very much helpful as the department tries to write rules to address the things that it can. There are some things that the Congress will have to act on. Russ mentioned the limiting the amount of aid that students enrolled via distance can receive is something that requires statutory change, and so Congress will have to take that particular issue on. And I don't know exactly where the Congress will come out. I know that I get very concerned about where we place a particular mode of delivery at disadvantage. And so if you said you can't get living expenses paid by Title IV funds if you're enrolled via distance, it really does disadvantage it when compared to somebody going to a community college. And when that educational offering might actually be better and more targeted at their particular needs. So I worry about that. The thing that was surprising about this whole fraud issue is the dollar amounts were not nearly as dramatically large as you'd expect. And so the Inspector General has had more patience on this issue, but at some point it is something that will be dealt with through rulemaking. I will also say the department has taken a number of administrative steps to address these issues along the way, capturing what high school people attended, was part of that, because what we learned through the fraud rings that were ongoing at the time were they didn't know anything about the person they were granting the identities of, and except that which they knew to ask for. And so anything you ask for, new and different, tripped them up. But that only works for so long, and at some point there have to be more systemic changes made in terms of how aid is dispersed to students, so that checks aren't mailed, cash isn't picked up, and those kind of things are addressed.
Great. And then Allison, how is this going to be kind of digested on Capitol Hill, if at all, and how will it impact HEA reauthorization?
So this is the type of thing that Congress wants to look at, and it is the type of thing that is going to play a very large role in reauthorization. Whether or not it should, it's obviously something that should be addressed. But the moment the IG comes out saying that there's millions of dollars in fraud happening, Congress is going to try to step in and say, well, this is what we need to do to stop it. And I think it was David talked about being concerned about how what the heavy-handed approach is going to be in response to that, and I think that that's going to be the concern, and it really is going to come down particularly to the online education community to make sure that you're educating the members and staff as to, because I can see some of the comments on the side, that fraud isn't necessarily just easier online, that there are concerns about you don't know who is in your classroom when you're having a face-to-face class, much less who is in the classroom when you're online. And I think it's important to get that message out, because, and the earlier the better, because once the impression is already made on the staff and the member level, it's very, very hard to undo. And I think that the IG report is going to have an impact.
Right. Thanks so much, Allison. We're going to move over to affordability as the topic here. The question here is, everyone's concerned about the astronomical rise in the cost of higher ed. Add to that misconceptions by the public at large, including members of Congress, that gets to exactly what Allison was just saying, about the intersection of affordability and online. This concern will certainly underscore many decisions of this round of HEA reauthorization. More specifically, how does e-learning help or hinder student affordability? What role does technology play in reducing or increasing the cost of higher education? What do legislators need to know? Let's start with David this time.
So it's interesting. A couple of years ago, everyone was saying that the answer to the affordability question in higher education was MOOCs, massive online open courses. And what we've come to understand is that MOOCs may play a role, but they're not the answer. Who enrolls in MOOCs are not first generation new college students. They're people with bachelor's degrees and master's degrees and PhDs, and certainly there's concern about the ability of students to graduate from massive online courses. That said, everybody thought when distance learning first came along that would be the answer, that those programs being delivered through online would save tremendous amounts of money. And in reality, what we all have come to learn, and probably many on this webinar knew instinctively because of their work with technology, was that the technology was going to cost a lot of money. But more than that, the academic support and instruction was going to cost as much or more than in an on-the-ground context. And so online has not proved to be the magic bullet on affordability. And in point of fact, it probably is something that we really need to dispel the myth around. And really begin to be very much more able to come forward with data to show why it costs more money. The other thing is, just in general, people don't get the cost thing in higher education. Everybody thinks that it costs $40,000 to $60,000 a year to go to a four-year college, even though those are the most expensive colleges in the country that are public 4 years, and our community colleges are much more affordable. And those institutions also offer opportunities that are online or hybrid. And so, ultimately it is a question of a lot of information being exchanged before policies start getting written that are difficult to implement or which are harmful to the students we're really trying to serve.
Russ, what do you think? How does e-learning help or hinder student affordability?
Yeah, I think it's probably hasn't played as big a role as it can up to this point, and we get into this issue about a lot of the focus of distance education has been on access. So if we divvy up the idea of costs or affordability into the institution, what the institution charges in tuition and fees to a student to attend the institution, and what the student's costs are for student living expenses and such, that for especially for an adult student with a family that they may be interested in paying a little bit more in tuition and fees in order so that they don't have to move to the city or move their whole family and upset their lives. I've certainly seen that model played over and over again, especially in my days in North Dakota, where you were trying to keep people in the rural areas and not having them move away. So it's controlled costs in that way. Where it hasn't done a good job is in controlling the costs on that instruction side. And we typically, what we'll do is that we do something that's very akin to what we do already in the face-to-face course. It looks a lot like the lecture. We've just put some technology around it. And if you do exactly what you did before and add technology, that means you have the costs you had before plus the new costs of the technology and whatever costs you have for transmission and such. So those end up being higher costs. And we've done studies on this, and we've looked at institutions been doing this, and there are those who have figured out what to do to lower costs. But the funny thing is, and I've run into this place after place, and that we've not made it a priority. We've not told people that one of our goals is to lower costs. In the place where that has been a goal, that they've figured out how to do that most of the time, or there's some I'm thinking of where they pretend that they've done it, but there's others where you look at Real Salado College or University of Maryland University College or others that have managed to maintain costs by using people differently or doing things differently. And it really is something where those in leadership need to challenge those on campus to think that, well, we want you to do this, but also what can you do in terms of also containing costs? And I think that people can come up with ways of doing that. It just seems so simple in terms of we've not asked people to do it, so they haven't done it.
So Allison, let me ask a different variation on the same question essentially, which is we never seem to be able to get away from the inexorable association between online e-learning and profit. Do legislators, in your experience working on Capitol Hill, view this connection as a draconian way as we suspect they do? And also, I'd love to hear what you think about the role of technology and cost from your perspective and your experience on the Hill.
So I think there are two things. I think that Congress looks at staff and the members. They look at online learning in two ways. They either look at it as MOOCs or they look at it as for-profit schools. I'm not saying that that's the reality of what's available, but that is how they look at it. And the MOOCs are sexy and they're the in thing, and that's what staff wants to, I would think that they're going to kind of focus on, and something that the members understand. And while the education community has come to the conclusion that it's not the answer for affordability and access, I'm not sure that the members and staff are there yet. When you look on the other side of it, this idea that everybody else who does online education is a for-profit school, then combining it, going back to the IG issue and fraud and some of these other things, I think that it does get all wrapped in together. And part of that is because most of the people who are working on this issue never have taught an online class, they've never taken an online class, and so they just don't have they just don't know. And what they are hearing from is they're hearing from people who have had bad experiences and not hearing the good stories. They're not people who have taken have had good experiences with blended classes or have taken classes all online. It's very unusual to get a University of Maryland, University College person testifying in a hearing, right? So it's always about the for-profits because that's where the scandalous stories can be.
And even more infrequent to have a UMUC alum as a congressional staffer, I would presume.
That's also the unfortunate reality.
All right, I'm going to move over to innovation to keep us on time. Many innovations have occurred since the last reauthorization, such as the growth of competency-based learning, flipped classrooms, badges, learning analytics, personalized learning, and the emergence of non-collegiate providers like Straighterline and the Khan Academy, to name a few. So we're in this era of revolution in ed tech. What impact will all this innovation have on reauthorization? And what lessons can we learn about trying to regulate innovations that we don't even know are happening yet? Let me start with Russ on this one.
Great, thank you, Chris. I think that all these things coming out could really have a big impact in reauthorization, and we keep coming back to the affordability issues. So there's going to be people are going to be looking to see, are any of these tools helping with affordability. I also think that with the great series that the Chronicle did about the disinvestment in public education in many states, that are we going to need to be turning to alternative solutions and looking at them. And so there's going to be a need to be looking at what do we do about the quality of those? How do those articulate or transfer into the current system? So a student goes to Straighterline and goes to Khan Academy, and how does that fit in with furthering higher education or getting a credential? Or are colleges willing to accept that? And then also. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there for us to be looking at that, and then in looking at the wording and going forward, we need to make sure that we're not. We always try to regulate backwards, right? So we're looking at what is new and innovative up to the day the regulation is, or a year before the regulation is. By the time it gets to, we look at what is in place then, and a lot of times those things get into the regulation. For example, let me use, I'm on this negotiated rulemaking committee, and one of the proposed language talked about putting student notifications on the websites. Okay, well that's good. Well, we made the progress from last time up to recognizing there's such thing as the World Wide Web in the world, but we pointed out in the committee, said, oh yeah, but a lot of institutions now are going to putting their notifications onto mobile media or other sources as well. So we need to think about that there is going to be technologies going to be used, there's going to be modes of education invented in the next few years. Who would have known what a MOOC was 3 years ago? There's going to be all this innovation coming, so we need to make sure that as we're developing the language that we are looking so that it's open enough so that it includes a future that we don't know what it is.
Yeah. Great answer. Thanks so much, Russ. Allison, what do you think? What's the impact of all this innovation that's happening on reauthorization?
I think it's going to play an interesting role. Senator Alexander, in particular on the Senate side, has been very interested in some of these other ways to control his costs. And you mentioned competency-based learning, and there's been a huge focus on the staff level, on the member level, to understand the role that competency-based learning can play in education, as well as reaching out to the business community and figuring out, well, does that actually then help lead to jobs when when folks graduate, because the folks who are graduating from college right now are also very often the ones who are having trouble finding new jobs in their new field. And so I think it's going to play an interesting role, and I think that there's a lack of understanding about it. It's still fairly new. It's one of those things that I think that there's a lot of interest in. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
Great. And David, what do you think? Innovation.
So I think innovation in higher education is something that everybody knows and understands and embraces. As Russ said, what always happens, though, is that we know what the innovation is that has occurred. We can't envision what the innovation looks like that will occur in 5 years. And so this is difficult, and therefore you need a piece of legislation that is flexible enough to embrace the transformative change that will be coming. That's great, but Congress doesn't like to leave open-ended legislation that is subject to regulatory interpretation by an administration, and they certainly have made it more difficult for the department to be responsive to changes that do occur. Russ has mentioned a couple times that he's on a negotiated rulemaking committee. And while I'm a strong advocate for negotiated rulemaking as a mechanism for getting the best rules possible, it does create a time constraint that makes it difficult for the department to respond quickly to things that are happening in higher education. So that means we need a flexible statute without regulatory barriers or barriers being placed on the ability of the executive branch to respond to the changes as they occur. That's not been the trend in recent reauthorizations of the Higher Education Act, and it's probably not what anyone who would be lobbying the Congress for changes is going to be lobbying for. They're going to be asking for more specificity, more limitations on the ability of the Secretary to regulate, because that's what has been going on for the last couple of reauthorizations.
So David, on that same point, you penned a piece in Inside Higher Ed a few months ago about alternate providers. Could you explain your thesis, and how do you think accreditors will react to your thesis?
It's been a great conversation to have with accreditors after my piece appeared in Inside Higher Education, because I basically called the question about what is it that is really being accredited by our nation's accreditors. Because from my perspective, what should be being accredited is the level at which the learning is occurring. And learning doesn't occur generally at an institutional level or even at a program level. It occurs in courses. And so we were Steve Klinsky and I called for accreditors to begin to accredit at the course level. And that opens up the possibility of things like MOOCs or straight or line being able to access Title IV funds because they would be accredited. There was another response, though, and it's been interesting to think about that alternative response at a place like Sarah Lawrence, where they're assessing learning of all of their students systemically and holistically as they move through their educational program, with an eye towards what competencies or capabilities, I should use their term, they want to have all of their students to have by the time that they graduate. And so they're really creating a holistic assessment of the learning that every student is engaged in. And that is another way of overcoming my concern, which is we have a accreditation occurring at the institutional level, and yet learning is only being delivered and only being assessed at the course level, and we need to bridge that gap.
So Russ and Allison, what do you think about this? I'll start with you, Allison, in terms of looking at higher ed reauthorization and accreditation reform. How can something like David's proposal, putting a focus on a different level for accreditation, work when you're rewriting the law?
I think it's something. I think it's something that Congress will look at. I think that the thing that needs to be, that folks need to be careful about when they're having the discussion is that you don't want Congress to be the one, or you don't want the Department of Education to be the one actually doing the accreditation of whether it's courses or programs. And there's always the risk when Congress starts to get involved in the nitty-gritty details like this, that is what starts to be developed, and you can end up with all sorts of other problems by having accreditation being controlled by Congress. And so, and it's part of, to be honest, it's part of what blew up the not the course level accreditation, but just accreditation in general is part of what blew up and made reauthorization so difficult the last time, and that was because Congress was not happy with what the Republican Congress was not happy with what the Republican president was doing, and there were all kinds of difficulties there, and that was when everybody was on the same political page. So I think it's a very touchy issue. It's something that I think is going to be on the top, like in the top 2 or 3 topic areas. It's one of those things that there's going to be a fight about how much control actually should be coming from the federal government versus coming from the accrediting agencies themselves.
So Russ, alternate providers, accreditation, what do you think?
Well, I think people have already voted with their mice or with their feet, or however you want to say it, that we're getting more and more people who are going to the Khan Academies of the world. Certainly all the open content that is out there. There's a lot of really great things that are out there in open content which we haven't talked about, and something that we should really want to promote. So, and I don't see that abating. I see more and more people going to those resources because as we move forward, learning is going to become more modular. The need is going to become more just in time. So we better get out in front and figure out how this fits into our system, and whether it's accreditation or however it is that we do it, we better start addressing that pretty directly. One last point on this. That was a positive point on it. I will speak against one of the bills that are out there at this point, where it would allow such accreditation to happen state by state. So each state could have its own accreditation of these sorts of activities. Boy, if you think state authorization is exciting, imagine accreditation by state. That could be even more fun. So I hope we come up with something that's more systematic than state by state.
So David, this is your brainchild. Any response to Allison and Russ?
Well, I have to agree with Russ on his last point. Really important. I think Senator Lee is well-intentioned in calling for an expedited process for the recognition of state-level accreditors, but it ignores the fact that we've been recognizing state-level accreditors under the Higher Education Act for a long time. New York Board of Regents is a great example of this, and so if states had wanted to do it, they would have done it by now. I also agree with Allison that this is going to be a very touchy subject, and when I first penned the piece and put it out inside higher ed, we knew it would be provoke a response. I was surprised that it provoked the response that it did, where people were saying, well, you're calling for burning the house down before you know what the new house looks like. And I said, well, we weren't saying that you burnt down what was there. We were saying we need to find a way to allow alternative entities to get accredited. And I do continue to believe that there are ways that one could do that, either by creating new accreditors, current accreditors expanding their scope, and including some of the nationals that we haven't talked about, which might be more inclined to pursue some more innovative things than the regionals have been wont to do until fairly recently.
Great. So we have about 5 or 6 minutes left before we get to Q&A. I'd like to cover 2 more questions. The second one will be quite brief. So in the concluding section here, whether it's Senate Health Chairman Harkin's series of hearings on for-profit education for its broader concerns about college affordability that impact all students going into higher ed for whatever age, higher ed seems to be suffering from a crisis of confidence. What should be done in this HEA reauthorization to restore public confidence in our nation's higher ed system? I'll start with you, Russ.
Great. I'm not sure what specifically should be in the law as much as how we deal with how reauthorization is done, and I think that a bit of it is PR, that we need to show ourselves as a toolbox and not a tool. And what I mean by that is that we still have in the mind of many of these people, as Allison brought up before, that they still have in mind that it's the 18 to 22 year old who's attending Princeton, Harvard, or Iowa, to pick a state at random, picking Iowa or Iowa State, that they would be attending there, and that there's still a lot of thought and a lot of the regulation goes around that, whereas I think higher education has really developed over the last number of years, where with going way back to community colleges, but distance ed and all sorts of innovations that have come out in terms of being able to serve people across the board and getting that message in there, plus making sure the regulations fit people who are all across the board. Now on the flip side, what won't help us, and some things we haven't talked about, is this perception that we're increasingly charging higher and higher amounts of money, but yet we seem to be the last bastion of slavery or servitude, because we've got the whole thing going on with the Northwestern football issue, where those people are not getting paid, and that will fall into this. People are going to worry about that. And also the whole thing, if you've followed, about adjunct or contingent faculty, that we're having adjunct faculty, contingent faculty who are teaching 7-8 courses and are still on welfare. And so that doesn't help us, and so we need to, that's something that if we don't solve for ourselves, that it may be of interest for Congress to solve for us.
So Allison, what do you think in about a minute or so? What's the best way to restore confidence in the U.S. higher education system in reauthorization?
I think that the conversation, there needs to be a recognition that there's two reasons to go to college. You're going for the idea of learning and expanding your opportunities and your experiences, but you are also going for to have better employment opportunities and everything when you actually graduate. And that conversation needs to be, it's not just education for education's sake, is definitely part of it, and for some people that's the only reason. But it's not the reason for everybody, and I think we have to be careful about that part of the conversation, because it really does make a difference as to how the reauthorization conversations are going to go forward.
And finally, David, what do you think about the crisis of confidence?
One of the things that I've been thinking about here at the Center for American Progress is really convening a conversation on this very point, that bring education leaders together and say, what is it that we need to do to restore confidence? Very clearly, I'm at one of these places in my life where I, like Allison, recognize there's a point where it's all about jobs. My daughter's about to graduate from college. We're very fortunate that she has done that in 4 years. And now she's about the business of taking that degree and translating it into a job. And so I think that to the extent that we have students coming out of our educational institutions who are not prepared for the world of work, that's a problem. But I also think the other side of that's also true, that our employers are unrealistic sometimes about what they expect of our college graduates. If you go back a generation, our major employers really did expect that they would invest substantial amounts of money in preparing and training their employees once they had that credential in their hands. and because of the demands of the economy, employers have backed away from that, and our institutions haven't recognized it. So I think we've got to get to a place where we bridge this fundamental disconnect between employers and our colleagues like the Chamber and the institutions of higher education, so we get to a place where we get out of the blame game and get into a place where we're all working together, placing our attention on the students and the graduates and what they need to be successful.
Great, thanks. And so this is the last question before we open it to our e-room here for Q&A. And I'd like to be it's like the McLaughlin group at the end, what's going to lead the week. So in 10 seconds or less, each of you, what's the one piece of advice you could give to those people on this webinar and who might watch later about how to reach out to congressional members and their staff about reauthorization? I'm going to start with you, Allison.
No, I mean, I think it's important to have I think it's important for the community to have a single message and to figure out what that is now before reauthorization discussions have gone too far, and to just be out there and educate the staff and educate the members, because I think that there is a lot of education that needs to be done.
David, one piece of advice.
Well, Allison just stole mine. I think that one of the things that I'm so aware of is how much the staff has changed up in the Congress since the last reauthorization. There are some really great people, very well informed, who continue to be there, but that has changed and will continue to change over time. And so, just because you educated the great staffers who are there today, maintain contacts if there's a change, and make sure you get back and reconnect and make sure that they have the information they need to make good support to the members as they move forward to move legislation.
And Russ, one piece of advice.
Well, I'll give two, but I'll be quick. And one is it's about students. Don't worry. Don't harp on how it's tough on institutions. It's about students. Second, don't assume that they know what you're talking about. You may need to clarify exactly what your issue is that you're communicating about. So just give them the background so that they know how that fits into their talks.
Sorry to interrupt you there, Russ. So Q&A, we have a bunch of questions, and if we could keep this moving as much as we can, panelists, that would be great, so we can answer as many people's questions as possible. The first one that I see here that I find quite interesting is, who besides WCET is lobbying Congress on behalf of distance ed? And I'll put a little substance in there myself before we turn to Russ about whether WCET is lobbying Congress. One issue that's been pervasive in this sector is a lot of the changes that have happened in the past, whether it's in 92 or 98, that have been very positive for Title IV in terms of for distance learning students, have been reactive. So they've been in reaction to an institution that was in trouble and needed a legal fix, and hired lobbyists and created a coalition and made the change in the law, and it wound up benefiting everybody. But this sector has been very bifurcated, and you have a lot of higher ed institutions, higher ed associations in Washington where they have a large number of issues that they must cover, and e-learning is only one of them. So as a result, you haven't had one consolidated voice, as Allison was talking about. So it's a lot of institutions and associations' side interests, but it's not necessarily their core interest. So it doesn't necessarily lead to a lot of direct lobbying and a lot of real thoughtful conversations about what's going on the ground. But I'll turn that to you, Russ. Who besides WCET is lobbying Congress?
We're probably the one that's done the most over the last year or so, that we've been working with Sloan C and UPSIA and EDUCAUSE and a few others in terms of what can we do to try to get a more singular message, and those conversations are going to continue in terms of trying to get those organizations work together. The others who lobby Congress are those who are in the presidential associations, ACE, APLU, and AACC, and those. But you have to remember when you're talking about the distance ed educational technology issues that those are one of many issues that they have, and sometimes they fall farther down their list. And so it's good to engage them, but it doesn't always fit high in their priorities depending on what else is on the docket at the time.
Great. I'm going to move to another question. Allison, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, the chamber actually is also lobbying Congress on this. This is something that we feel very strongly about, and as somebody who used to teach as a online professor, I have personal experience doing distance education, and so it's actually been an interesting education experience for the staff.
So, David, I have a question directly for you. Mr. Bergeron, what is your position on state authorization?
Yeah, I saw that show up in the chat window, and I went, oh, I wish somebody hadn't asked me that question. Actually, you know, when I worked in the administration, very clearly this was a contentious issue. And when we published the final rule, we realized that we had a public comment that we had to respond to, where somebody had asked us, well, what about distance learning? How does that fit in? And we responded to that comment to say that essentially institutions have to comply with state laws wherever they operate. And that's generally true. If you are a traditional bricks and mortar college and you are doing fundraising outside of your home state, you better be following the rules in the state you're fundraising in. So if you're Rhode Island, where I went to school, and you've got alums that are living in Alaska, better know what the solicitation rules for fundraising are in the state of Alaska. And you know, we incorporated that concept into the final regulation, and we had a little trouble with the courts over it. The reason I tell that story is because it is directly relevant. You know, I think that the work that has been going on around reciprocity is a critical piece of work. Would it have been better to have taken place before the department regulated state authorization the first time? Absolutely. You know, we would not have had that provision the way we did in the final rule, and we would have been in a very different place when we negotiated. And so I think one of the real big takeaways over the last couple of years is how when we all agreed that there is an issue, we can find a solution to the problem. And it wasn't even really that hard. I will also say that the folks involved in that effort are really fortunate to have some of the people that they have involved in it, because I think in that instance the leadership has been also as critical as the idea. You know, and I think that that's a big part of it, that the leadership of that effort has really listened to everyone and brought together the best minds to solve that problem.
So Russ, I'm going to let you respond to David's comment, but also there are a lot of questions on state authorization, so let me ask you one of them to combine it. Will there continue to be exemptions to state authorization under SARA so that individuals, institutions still need to seek certain special authorizations such as licensure and accreditation, licensure and certification, excuse me? Russ.
Okay, well I'll start with the first one, and actually I'll take the state authorization from the point of view of the negotiated rulemaking, just let people know what that is, because looking at the comments, maybe not everyone does, that there is, Department of Education is looking at 6 different proposed areas to regulate at this time. State authorization of distance education is one of those areas. I am one of the negotiators on that team representing distance education. There are proposals about what that should look like that are out there, and I put our blog posts so that you can go in the chat room, so you can go back if you want to see some of the history of what's happened. Moving forward, I think that there's several positive steps that have been taken, that the federal government does the Department of Education does really want to bring back the federal regulation tying state authorization to financial aid. So I think that that is going to happen, whether you like that or not. That does seem to be where they are going. We're just trying to, from my point of view, just trying to make sure that it's not too onerous in terms of other types of rules or commitments that are required of the institutions to put on top of that. So, and we could spend a whole hour on that, but I'll move on to your second question, which is about exemptions for licensure under SARA. SARA does not cover licensure programs such as nursing, teacher ed, social work, and such. It was just enough to do just to get the institutional approval that at this point it couldn't deal with all of the licensure issues. So if you're in a SARA state and you're a SARA institution, you still have to go through, if you're teaching nursing, you'd still have to go through nursing, the teaching requirements and such. Good news, nursing is working on something that they don't like to call reciprocity, but actually looks a lot like reciprocity because it uses the home state model. And I'm trying to work up some ways that we can work with other professions so that we can have similar reciprocity models for the other professions. Those are very, very, very early and nowhere near as far as the nursing.
Great, Russ. I'm going to start with Allison on this next one, and it's actually a bunch of different questions and comments, so I'm going to synthesize them into one. Should the oversight of online programs look substantially different than the oversight of on-ground programs? If so, how so? What standards should be used? And should the WCET community be fighting for the standards to be the same? So Allison, you start, please.
So this is something that we've actually talked a lot about at the Chamber, and we think that it doesn't matter. Online, brick and mortar, the standards should be the same. Education is education, and we should have very clear expectations, both as the consumers of the education and as the accreditors. But no, online schools should be treated the same as brick and mortar schools. For-profit schools should be treated the same as not-for-profit schools. That's kind of a simple answer.
Let me turn that over to you, David. Sorry, Allison.
So I disagree a little bit with Allison. I do think that we do have to make distinctions between types of institutions, and to really think very carefully about when we lump all the institutions and modes of delivery together. The example of this I'll use right now is competency-based, which I'm a huge fan of. And as everybody knows, I think right now institutions have to go to their accreditor, get their accreditor to agree to allow them to do competency-based instruction, and then they have to go to the department and get that approved. The reason that's true, and maybe it needs to be changed in reauthorization, is that nobody knows how to pay financial aid using competency-based models, and we have learned some things with help from places like Western Governors University and more recently our learning with College for America about how to do that. But if the department had just said, you know, you don't need to come to us for approval for competency-based programs, there wouldn't be anyone capturing what we're learning about how to deliver aid in those contexts. Nobody would be necessarily conscious of the differences, and which could lead to some people awarding aid that ultimately the institution might be liable to repay, and the department would be liable to recover. So, you know, dealing with these kind of liability issues are a large part of that approval process. The other thing I'd say is we also have some other models of some 7 experiments that are going on under the Experimental Sites Authority. Again, hoping that we will learn some things that will be helpful as we move forward and think about whether we should be, for example, making aid available to programs that are shorter than are currently authorized, or are really fundamentally different than the things we traditionally awarded. And I know the department's currently reviewing additional experimental sites proposals. So I like having some differentiation of the way we deliver education, and I want to see us to do it in a way that is experimental, evaluative, and protective of government resources.
Okay, well, I think we have reached our time, and I really appreciate Chris moderating and our wonderful panelists today. So thank you for your contributions. Thank you to the audience for your questions. And if you have questions, go ahead and enter them here. We'll keep the room open for a few more minutes. I do want to just mention a few things. If you want to learn more about WCET, if this was your first interaction with us, do consider attending one of our events or looking into membership. We have an upcoming leadership summit in Salt Lake City, which will talk about alternative pathways to credentials, including competency-based learning. We have a boot camp on data analytics, which will be a deep dive into getting your organization ready to start their data initiative. And that's June 17th through 20th in beautiful Vail, Colorado. You can visit the WCET website, which is referenced here. There's access to numerous resources, including our very robust state authorization resources. Save the date for our annual meeting, which is November 19th through the 21st in Portland. Do consider membership. Benefits extend to everyone at your organization, and you have access to our very dynamic listserv, which includes conversations around all of these hot topics. The webcast is being recorded. We'll post it on our website, and I'll send out the link next week. Thank you to Blackboard Collaborate for making the platform available, our very valuable supporting members, which underwrite many of our activities and our programs, our annual sponsors, Blackboard, Cengage, CourseSmart, VitalSource, Pearson Learning Solutions. And that concludes our webcast, or our video cast today. So if you have any comments about the video capabilities that we provided today, we'd love to hear more so we can consider if this is going to be the platform that we go forward with. Again, thank you to everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Allison.